Well, it looks like the DCEU is absolutely positively dead now that the new Superman movie is hitting theaters. It lasted about 9 years, which is about 9 years longer than the Universal Dark universe, so at least it can hold its head up high there. I'd like to take the chance here to break down what I feel went wrong with the DCEU, what went right, and I'd like to rank the films from worst to best. So the intention from the get-go of this joined DC universe was clear. Marvel just started making buckets of money from the MCU, the Avengers became one of the highest grossing films of all time, and Warner Bros. Wanted a piece of that comic book market share. And they had all the DC comic properties at their disposal. They were actually coming from a stronger standpoint than Marvel did when it started. Apparently the first attempt at this was the 2011 Green Lantern movie, which failed at the box office, but also, in my opinion, not as terrible as people made it out to be. It's not great, but it's not that terrible. So the actual start of the series was 2014's Man of Steel, an origin story of Superman directed by Zack Snyder. Because of that, this series would loosely be called the Snyiderverse, since he largely determined the overall direction of the universe, whether through establishing this darker tone overall, or just because he casted the original trio of heroes and many of the side characters. He also, however, is a very divisive filmmaker, garnering praise for his visual style, but often getting criticism for having not as much substance under the hood of those impressive visuals. As for where I stand, I'm not a Zack Snyder hater, nor a fanboy. I feel very mixed on him as a filmmaker, and acknowledge his accomplishments as a director, while also admitting that sometimes he sacrifices too much for the sake of visual iconography. I think it was risky to hand him the keys of such a large part of the DC universe, since his adaptation of Watchmen was not the runaway hit the studio wanted, and was also pretty divisive among moviegoers. But he was handpicked by Christopher Nolan for the job, so he must have provided a decent treatment for Man of Steel. And to be fair, I actually liked a lot of Man of Steel. I know there are choices that made some die-hard Superman fans very upset, but I've never been particularly attached to the character myself and his pure Boy Scout image. The grittier take on him was kind of refreshing to me, and while I wouldn't put it up against the best of comic book films, I thought it was a great counterpoint to the more fun comic book aesthetic of the Marvel films. While they were trying to reverse engineer the success of Marvel, they wanted the DC films to stand apart from them tonally, and I do appreciate that. But already, by 2016, we can start to see where the direction of the DCEU was faltering. Rather than making a proper film to introduce the next character in the universe, we got team-up movies. We've established only one character, and are teaming him up with other characters already. This showed a very transparent level of impatience with Warner Bros., and an unwillingness to do the work as Marvel had done for their universe years before. This brings us to Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which should have been at least the fourth movie in this universe. While this was a bad move as far as the big picture goes, I'll admit, I don't hate the movie like some people do. The opening scene is thrilling, and there are lots of elements tonally and performance-wise that work for me. I just think that there is a wasted opportunity to build up a universe properly, so that the big events in this film, such as the battle between Batman and Superman, and Superman's death, were able to have the impact that they could have had if the homework was done properly. This should have been a huge event film, but it fell flat for many moviegoers. That being said, it was a financial success, so this showed that audiences were interested in what the DCU had to offer, potentially. Later that year, we got what I feel is the biggest missed opportunity of this whole series, and that is Suicide Squad. The reins of this film were taken by David Ayer, a hot, buzzy filmmaker coming off of critical hits like End of Watch and Fury. Allegedly, he was only given something like 6 weeks to write the script before moving into pre-production, and much of the film was rewritten and reshot on the go, making for one extremely messy filmmaking process. The concept of the Suicide Squad was to gather a collection of supervillains into an expendable strike force, who are there to be used and discarded by the government in the event of a supervillain event, like a bad Superman or whatever, something on the level of what General Zod was in Man of Steel. The concept is great, but for this to be the third movie in a universe like this is harebrained. This is the kind of movie you throw into a mix around the time Marvel put their chips in with Guardians of the Galaxy. You want us to care about your collection of rogues? At least give them a movie to actually be the bad guys. How awesome would this have been if this movie was populated by already established villains in the universe? And while a few good things came out of this movie, ultimately it was a creative disaster, and I still think it stands as the worst movie in the DCEU. Now, whether that's the fault of the director or the studio, we'll never know, since we'll likely never see the Ayer cut of the movie. But I will say that it would have been at least a consistent creative vision if the studio and the director were on the same page. But because of an amazing marketing campaign, one can definitely say that the Suicide Squad was a financial success and pulled in huge amounts of money at the box office, and likely through Hot Topic merchandise sales. 2017 had a much more promising start as the summer saw the release of Wonder Woman, directed by Patty Jenkins. And this is for sure one of the bright spots of the DCEU. It has the opportunity to be fairly independent of the other movies in the series since it takes place during World War I and well before any other film in the DCEU. And that's the kind of movie we should have been seeing all along to start us on this journey. A solid standalone superhero flick. While not a perfect movie, it overall really works for me, and has some scenes that are already iconic. The scene where she traverses the battlefield is a real showstopper, and is so good it basically sets up the final act to not quite meet that standard, but hey, nailing that third act is tough. This film definitely showed Hollywood that you could have a female-led action movie and have it perform well at the box office. Just, do it well, and Wonder Woman largely delivered. At the end of the year, we saw what this whole journey so far was leading up to, and that was the Justice League. And while not a complete box office disaster, the consequences of Warner Bros. Impatience showed, and it did not deliver anything near what the Avengers did 5 years prior. To the surprise of nobody really, let's be honest. DC copied Marvel's answers, but didn't show the work, so this is what happens. Of course, this wasn't the only thing that plagued Justice League. Since there were so many mixed opinions of what Zack Snyder had done before, Warner Bros. Was trying very hard to pivot away from the darker vision. And when he needed to step away from the project due to a personal family tragedy, they even brought in the Avengers director Joss Whedon to finish the movie and do some reshoots. And these are two directors who couldn't have been more different in what their visions are creatively. So what we get is this inconsistent mess of a movie that has no idea what it is or what it even wants to be. Whedon tries to insert his signature humor, and much of that falls flat. The stuff Zack Snyder shot was altered and color corrected so it wouldn't look so dark, but it just looks hideous. But it's also not like the worst comic book movie ever. It's too scared to take risks enough to even be that horrible. It's a sanitized product for mass consumption, made to appease everyone and thus will truly connect with no one. It was made to be inoffensive, not to be good, and so it mostly just is dull and forgettable. Say what you will about Batman v Superman, its blunders were so memorable that they permeated and sunk their claws into pop culture because it at least swung for the fences and tried.
Why did you say that name?
Over a year later, we got Aquaman, directed by James Gunn, who is best known for his work creating the Conjuring universe. And having a talented director and a charismatic leading man in Jason Momoa really paid off because Aquaman wound up being the biggest financial success in the DCEU, grossing over $1 billion at the box office worldwide. As far as reception goes, it was mostly positive. And while I'm not the biggest fan of the film, I have to give credit for amazing production design and world building, as well as mostly good performances and direction. I think where it falters is in the story department, because I honestly can't even tell you what the story was in the movie. I don't remember what happened. I remember that any time the film slowed down to actually compose itself and have characters connect, something would explode and everyone started running. But I will always give Aquaman credit and major points for having frickin' sharks with frickin' laser beams on their head.
Mr. Powers, you'll notice that all of the sharks have laser beams attached to their heads. I figure every creature deserves a warm meal.
I'm not joking. I really am giving points for that because ridiculous stuff like that is the kind of magic that we come to the movies for. Shazam came out in 2019 and was directed by David F. Sandberg. And though this superhero has never traditionally interested me much, this take on him wound up being a solid choice. Shazam felt fresh and original, very much feeling modern and clever, having it led essentially by a cast of youth, or adults pretending to be youth depending on who's on screen. It was dark, very funny, and worked well as a standalone film. This is easily one of my favorites from the franchise, but sadly the box office return wasn't as high as the bigger profile superheroes. That just comes with the risk of putting out big budget films of B-list superheroes. In this case, I think it paid off, though I'm sure Warner Brothers would have liked bigger numbers than that. But for my money, I think Shazam was one of the best flicks of the DCEU.
Oh hey, what's up? I'm a superhero.
Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn was a decent entry in the franchise, and was the first to lean into an R rating. It's very violent, but it shoots for the fences, and I respect that. One thing you cannot call it is sanitized for mass consumption. It focuses on Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn, so it really feels more like a solo movie with her, where she teams up with other anti-hero ladies for the final smackdown at the end. So I don't know if it really is a Birds of Prey movie that's loyal to the comics in any way. I liked it and appreciated that they only mentioned the horrible Jared Leto Joker and didn't bring him into the movie at all. It's not top tier, but it comes together nicely enough that it left me with a good impression. They clearly knew that the big draw from Suicide Squad was Harley Quinn, so I understand on them doubling down on the character, though it didn't perform as well at the box office. Though I'm not convinced it would have made nearly as much as the previous installments, I can say that at least some of the return was undermined by theaters closing down for the pandemic not long into its run. The COVID-19 pandemic threw a curveball, wrecking the box office outcome for Wonder Woman 1984, but that wouldn't have impacted any of the creative decisions for that film. I have to give my props to Patty Jenkins and company for being extremely ambitious with their new Wonder Woman script, as it tries to tackle big ideas like Cold War politics, Trumpism, sexism, grief and healing, and other topics that are difficult to tackle. And it fails spectacularly at almost all of it. It is downright impressive how they did so much right in the first film and did almost nothing right in this one. The whole Wish story is harebrained, and Chitara's story is underwhelming. The only thing that works for me in this movie is the dynamic between Diana and the sort of resurrected Steve Trevor, which I was actually expecting not to work, but was pleasantly surprised. I don't know, the story's just too much, the action is cartoony and ridiculous to watch, and the third act of the movie is so bewilderingly stupid that I can't believe Warner Brothers allowed this to pass. Like, what happened? Pandemic or no pandemic, I can't see this movie performing well at the box office as soon as word of mouth got out at how bad it was. James Gunn took a break from the Marvel Cinematic Universe to visit the DC Universe and make The Suicide Squad, a sequel/fresh start on the concept. You do not need to have seen the first film to see this one. It's difficult to even wrap my head around how much better this movie is compared to the first entry. Gunn understands the tone of a film like this needs to be balancing drama, action, and humor. It's a gory mess of a movie, so it's best to pay attention to that R rating and not bring the kids. It's probably gorier than my preferences, to be honest, but that didn't really ruin my time with the film. I still had a lot of fun with it. I would just have to more deeply consider who I would recommend this movie to. In this film, we got to see the full James Gunn at work. As much as his Guardians of the Galaxy movies are his work, he still needed to work in the confines of that universe. They needed to have more mass appeal. The Suicide Squad is not as concerned with that, as Warner Bros. Gave him carte blanche to do what he wanted, and he went for it. And it goes to show the risks of giving creative freedom to your filmmakers. Sometimes you get Suicide Squad, and sometimes you get The Suicide Squad. The biggest problem with The Suicide Squad is its title. It's too soon for it to be a clean break from the first movie, so it probably would have been better off to just be Suicide Squad 2, though I also understand why admitting to being a sequel to 2016's Suicide Squad is embarrassing, but for audiences it's just confusing. But I guess in a world where people know the order of the Fast and Furious movies, it shouldn't be too hard. Maybe Suicide Squad : another title? The Suicide Squad was not as successful at the box office. It didn't make back its budget and made a fraction of the first movie's haul. There could be a few reasons for this. Likely it being a post-pandemic film was part of it. People just weren't going back to the theater the way that they used to. It also premiered on HBO Max on the same day of release, undermining its box office potential. And it's possible there are people turned off the idea from the poor quality of the first movie, and they didn't want to return to the sequel, despite the change made in the creative teams. Not everyone pays attention to the creatives behind the film, so the quality of the brand matters. In a curious move by Warner Brothers, they actually gave Zack Snyder his opportunity to finish his version of the Justice League. And while many disagree on the quality of the final product, it does indisputably become Zack Snyder's film and is not a Frankenstein studio-mandated monster. And I personally like this version a whole lot more for its consistent tone and more appealing visuals. It's still not a perfect movie, but there's much more to like. The biggest flaw of this version is at least easily avoidable. There's an awkwardly long and entirely pointless epilogue to the film where Batman and the Joker are talking, and it's dreadfully tedious. And now we know it serves no purpose to any past or future narrative. So when the epilogue comes up, just turn the movie off and you're good. Do I feel like this version is going to completely win over people who hated the theatrical version of the Justice League? Probably not, but people who are more on the fence with that one, this one might actually win them over. Black Adam is one of the stranger choices in the DCEU catalog of films. Black Adam is in the comics a villain to Shazam, so this is kind of a deep-cut villain for a B-grade character. And while it could work in concept, they don't stay true to who Black Adam is. He's an anti-hero here, and looks like it's building up to him battling with Superman. With such a deep-cut character that they weren't intending to stay true to anyway, it puts a lot of pressure on Dwayne Johnson to be a selling point for this movie. Otherwise, I'm not sure who this movie is for. That being said, it is a competently made film if you can accept it for what it is. They do a good job of making Black Adam sympathetic and building the world around his character. And it was also cool seeing more deep-cut characters when they brought in the Justice Society to guest star. I don't remember much about the villain of this movie, so that's par for the course. All in all, it's a decent, mostly average outing for the DCEU. And while not a complete disaster financially, it also wasn't what the studio was looking for. Shazam! Fury of the Gods sees the return of Billy Batson, but mostly Shazam in this sequel. And while it's not a horrible film, it is remarkably okay, considering the first movie was such an unexpected surprise. This one misses what made the first film so special, though, which was the dynamic of Billy and Freddy's friendship, as Shazam figured out his powers. Naturally, understanding his powers is something that would be irrelevant in a sequel, but that void just wasn't filled with anything else compelling. The romance story doesn't feel genuine, and the familial business just feels redundant. It makes me wonder if a sequel was even needed for the character. That being said, the film is watchable, there's nothing groundbreaking or new in it, but it's not really cringy until the very end when Wonder Woman makes her obligatory cameo. Shazam! Fury of the Gods did not perform well at the box office. Despite a warm welcome in his first film, I guess enthusiasm for the character just didn't stick around. The Flash would be one of the final DCEU films after so many delays. I have mixed feelings about this film because some of it genuinely works, and other aspects are, for a lack of a better description, very cringy. I appreciate the ambition of the multiverse story, and the emotional arc of The Flash is fulfilling and effective. I really like this movie's take on Supergirl, and Michael Keaton's Batman is great to see again, but those ideas were underdeveloped and could have been so much more. There are also whole awkward sequences of saving poorly rendered animated babies and awkward multi-dimensional CGI fan pandering. If you can get past some of these sequences, there's a decent film in here, but it's definitely not consistent in quality, and difficult to recommend to anyone beyond a hardcore DC fan base. The Flash vastly underperformed and frankly cost way too much money to make. I don't think there's any one reason for its failure, but I think waning interest in the DCEU is a big part of it, as well as the star Ezra Miller's personal issues / criminal behavior being extremely off-putting. Personally, I feel the way to actually bring back Michael Keaton as Batman would have been if they made a Batman Beyond movie, so he could more naturally pass the torch along to a new Batman. But that's not happening here. I'm a bit unsure if this film is supposed to be part of the DCEU, because while James Gunn made a statement about it being the first chapter of the new DC film project, I kind of feel like that was to help its box office prospects, so the announced reboot wasn't throwing it under the bus. But for now, I'm going to count it. Blue Beetle is a pretty standard superhero origin plot, but it stands out from the pack thanks to a colorful cast of characters and the human story of family. It's a well-polished, well-performed film that is easy to like even if it is a bit derivative. I feel like it likely underperformed at the box office due to the confusion of what was happening with the DC brand, and probably because Blue Beetle isn't a particularly well-known character. DC just didn't get to that place where Marvel did, when moviegoers just have faith in anything you put out. And they never got the impression that every movie was indispensable. Sadly, some of the better movies in the franchise, like this one, suffered as a result. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is the movie that kind of unceremoniously ends the DCEU. And it could have certainly ended on a worse note. This Aquaman is about as good as the first one, except it lacks the frickin' sharks with the frickin' laser beams on their heads.
You know, I have one simple request, and that is to have sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
And that's disappointing. The story is kind of convoluted, but the characters have enough at stake and the action is fun enough that it's a decent bit of blockbuster entertainment. It's not amazing, but it's very watchable. Some people were saying how it was essentially a useless movie since it marked the end of the DCEU and there were no more movies in the universe. But I don't see it that way. Hell, most movies just come out with one installment, and lucky ones get a sequel. This story is self-contained enough that it functions as its own narrative. It isn't just a teaser for the next thing that's coming out. It's a movie unto itself, and it just happens to be the last chapter of this story. So is it worth seeing? Sure. If you liked the first Aquaman, you'll probably like this one enough. If you didn't like the first Aquaman, I don't see this one winning you over. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom performed okay at the box office, but it did not hit the billion-dollar high that the first movie did. So what would I have liked? What might have I done differently to make the DCEU stand up to Marvel? First, opening the universe with a Superman movie was a smart idea. He's a flagship character for a reason, and while Man of Steel isn't a perfect movie, it put down a decent enough foundation that there were a lot of places to go. But following it up immediately with a crossover film with two characters that hadn't been introduced before was a bad idea. I think the second film in the series should have been Wonder Woman, and it even could have been the exact version of Wonder Woman that came out. I'd then do The Flash, Aquaman, and a Batman movie. We could swap Flash and Aquaman if need be, but I keep Batman 5th there to give maximum breathing room between Affleck's Batman and the previous incarnation without undermining the plan for the Justice League movie. I might also throw in Man of Steel 2 in the mix, so we can really feel at home with Henry Cavill's Superman before killing him off in Batman v Superman crossover. After that, then we could bring in the Green Lantern, and then I think we have a firm enough foundation for a proper Justice League film. I realize this pushes the Justice League by quite a few years, but yes, that's the point. These films really needed more time in the oven, and Warner Brothers just wanted their Avengers movie right away, and that impatience did long-term damage to the vision of the franchise. And only then would I make a Suicide Squad movie, because we actually could have had some villains established. And of course, I'd give David Ayer a decent amount of time to actually make the film, and he might actually do a good job. I know he's got the potential to make good movies, but no one can work under those conditions. One thing I liked about Warner Brothers' approach on the theoretical side was the idea of siding with the filmmakers and putting their trust in the directors. In contrast to Marvel's approach, where ultimately the path of the series is guided by Kevin Feige. It's a riskier approach, but does make it so that the movies don't all feel the same. But the risks are apparent because the films are all very wildly uneven. So it's important that if you invest in a filmmaker, you need to give them the resources to make the movie good, and that includes time. And this approach was ultimately undermined because it seemed like after a while, the studio started to step in more and more and change the direction of the movies. So were filmmakers really given the creative freedom they were promised? I don't think so. So what are your thoughts on the 9-year run of the DCEU? What were your favorite films and what were your least favorites? Please tell me in the comments down below and let me know what you think of my take of the whole thing. But thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one.